What's up, everyone? As some of you have heard by now, I'm starting up an Olympic weightlifting club, and I just thought this would be a really good opportunity to hop on and do a video just broadly discussing my model for training Olympic weightlifters. If you're an OG follower of mine, like you'll remember between 2019 to 2022, basically, like there was a lot more Olympic weightlifting based content because that was sort of what I was most into at the time. It was who I was working with the most. Like my whole initial training model, which was the source for most of my content back then, was just basically a more strength and conditioning or GPP focused lens for training Olympic weightlifters. And as much as there was interest from Olympic weightlifting athletes and coaches, there was just even more traction with strength and conditioning coaches and personal trainers. I mean, weightlifting is a pretty niche sport at the end of the day. And as much as I'm passionate about weightlifting, like I'm just passionate about training people and educating other coaches in general. So there was just way less friction to just go in the way of working with a lot more just like I said, regular S&C more broadly and just personal trainers. And like, honestly, I feel like we had a pretty solid influence and we got a lot of momentum between those years up until sort of 2022, where we were influencing the way a lot of weightlifting coaches were training their athletes. And yeah, just regather some of the momentum I had on pushing some of these ideas in Olympic weightlifting in that period. But I can't expect Olympic weightlifting coaches to listen to me if I don't have more skin in the game and if I'm not producing results with Olympic weightlifting athletes. And so I wouldn't say I'm God's gift to weightlifting or anything like that, but by about 2018, 2019, I managed to train my way up to a 250 kilo weightlifting total. I snatched 110 kilos and I clean and jerked 140 kilos at a body weight of probably like, I think I was about 82 or 83 kilos at that point. There's been plenty of amazing weightlifting coaches and some really high level weightlifting athletes who've adopted these principles into their training and got some really good results with it. Like Chris Speed is someone who was also exploring similar ideas in his training in that period of time. And he's someone who's, snatched 140 kilos and clean and jerked somewhere between 170 and 180 kilos. I'll be honest, I only have one full-time weightlifter on my books at the moment, but he's very strong. Dylan, my client, snatches 150 kilos and clean and jerks currently 185 kilos. Hopefully we can push for, in a developmental block at the moment, but maybe in the next couple of months, you'll see 190 kilo clean and jerk from him. And again, he uses the GPP principles in his training. So what is the GPP approach to weightlifting? And so it's kind of given away in the name, general physical preparation. It is a much more broad spectrum and GPP approach to the training and development of Olympic weightlifters. As a weightlifting coach in a country like Australia, where, people are finding the sport in their late teens, early 20s, if they're lucky. So many of the weightlifting coaches in environments like this just have such an unnecessarily highly specific approach to the training of Olympic weightlifting. Like, don't get me wrong, the Olympic lifts are relatively technical, and you need to be really strong if you're going to be successful at Olympic weightlifting. But weightlifting is also highly athletic. That's why so many athletes that don't compete in Olympic weightlifting use the Olympic lifts to develop their athleticism. And it's kind of ironic because a lot of weightlifting coaches in countries like Australia, the UK, and the USA, they claim to have this really traditional approach to the development of Olympic weightlifters. But if you actually look at how a lot of these more revered weightlifting systems, like the Russian system, or the Chinese weightlifting system introduce their athletes to weightlifting at a young age, there is a very GPP approach to it. So a lot of these weightlifting coaches, because they're so keen to cosplay as a serious weightlifting coach, they approach the training of Olympic weightlifters who are so new to the sport with an unnecessarily high degree of specificity. And it's my belief that skipping the development of a lot of these general qualities, even for athletes who are getting introduced to the sport a lot later in life, it doesn't just lead to them stalling out in their progress, but it also leads to unnecessarily high amounts of injuries and just an unnecessarily constrained approach to the training of Olympic weightlifting. Like, unless you're pretty neurodivergent, you're probably going to get bored at Olympic weightlifting at some point. So if you just have some other corners of training to work on for a little bit, like I said, it can just make the process a little bit more enjoyable. And so, yeah, the same way a kid in China, when they get introduced into weightlifting, is also doing things like gymnastics, plyometric training, a whole heap of general strength training and bodybuilding and just general athletic development, right? That's exactly how we like to train our weightlifters here at General Physical Preparation. The thing that separates us from a lot of these traditional training systems is we never really leave the GPP phase. Don't get me wrong, we still increase specificity if you have a competition coming up, but A big part of the GPP model for weightlifting is we maintain a thread of all qualities year round. And this leads me to my next point for a lot of the traditional programming side for Olympic weightlifting. When it comes to programming strength training for Olympic weightlifters, in our model, we have a minimum effective dose approach. And there's two reasons for this. I just have a general belief that strength trainers get thrashed with way too high of volumes and frequency of not just strength training, but also the competition lifts. And I just think a lot of coaches and athletes would benefit from just constraining their dosages a little bit more. And the secondary benefit of this is it opens up so much extra space in the program where you can look at developing these complementary athletic qualities. And so the Olympic lifts and strength training never leave the program. But just for example, at certain periods of the year, I'm completely fine with my athletes Olympic lifting as little as one time per week with each of the competition lifts. But on average, I would say I give athletes at least 2 exposures to each competition lift throughout a weekly cycle, and even more getting closer to competition. But like I said, even in these periods of higher volumes and frequencies of the competition lifts and regular strength training, there is always a thread of at least plyometric training, doing a lot of different accessories and hypertrophy work, a little bit of cardio to keep them healthy. I'm also a really big fan of things like sprinting and gymnastics as well. Just a little bit of a side tangent about strength training for Olympic weightlifters as well. In 2019 to 2020, I had this huge beef with people considering the back squat to be a compulsory exercise for Olympic weightlifters. I love back squats. They're a tremendous exercise, but all of my best Olympic weightlifting cycles, I was front squatting only. I'm not saying that you have to do it this way, but yeah, you don't have to back squat to be an Olympic weightlifter. Dylan, my strongest client, he hasn't back squatted in years and he front squatted, I think it was 227 kilos the other day. So yeah, we're not as against back squatting as we used to be here at General Physical Preparation, but we definitely love a front squat only cycle. Even further than that, you know what we really love when it comes to building squat strength that a lot of traditional weightlifting coaches reject? We love machine squats and safety bar squats. If you're still giving your athletes sets of 10 on back squats after competition, I think you're nuts. Get them on a hack squat or a leg press. We also reject a lot of the periodization concepts found in traditional Olympic weightlifting. A lot of traditional periodization concepts are built on a very outdated understanding of stress developed by Hans Selye. You know, it's our understanding of stress that underpins our principles and decision making when it comes to programming. And most of these traditional periodization concepts were founded on this concept of general adaptation syndrome, which proposed that humans had a purely biological and very predictable response to stress. Whereas nowadays, you know, through the work of people as far back as George Engel in the 1970s and the development of the biopsychosocial model, but like I said, more recently through coaches and educators such as John Kiley, Mlad Jovanovic, and Mike Tuchscherer, it's our belief at General Physical Preparation that you should adopt a much more flexible, reactive, and collaborative approach to programming. So we place a huge emphasis on things like auto-regulation and the hero's journey. It's important that athletes' thoughts and preferences are listened to and worked into the programming where possible. And we just believe in the power of shared decision making. Like I said, rather than the more traditional, rigid, authoritarian application of traditional periodization, which is disappointingly prevalent these days in Olympic weightlifting, where in sports like powerlifting, you know, these ideas are widely accepted. We also don't really do traditional block periodization. We sort of favor a much more vertical integration approach. So there's always a thread of all qualities, but then we sort of rotate the emphasis periodically. But we have a very reactive and flexible approach to that even. We don't set an arbitrary block length, we individualize it to each athlete. Having said that, if you are sort of looking at how I would apply this approach in a systemic way, we're going to have team training available for the GPP Olympic Weightlifting Club, and there's going to be more information released on that in the next couple of weeks. If you're a coach who wants to understand more about these concepts, doesn't matter if you're not into Olympic weightlifting, check out my course, GPP Level 1, and that's linked down below. I'll see you in a couple of days with another video.